She was abandoned at the wooden bridge during World War II, until an American driver escorted her across winter in the countryside. Did not feel like a holiday season in wartime. It felt like a long sheet of cold that pinned down roads, roofs, and even voices. And on this afternoon in late 1944, the cold had reached the wooden bridge outside the occupied town and made the planks stiff beneath a thin layer of frost. Snow drifted across the frozen fields and settled against the bridge rails like chalk lines, drawn during training drills. And the local militia at the far end of the bridge shouted instructions for civilians to hurry across before sundown, so the guards could lift the bridge and close the road for night curfew. A woman carrying a medium-sized suitcase moved among the flow of civilians, but fell behind quickly because the wooden planks forced careful steps and the wind kept pushing against her coat, slowing her more than the others. The people ahead of her, including neighbors from her old street, glanced back once to see how far behind she was, and then looked forward again without slowing to offer help. Because in war, everyone worried about being last in line, and to be last in line meant being noticed. When she reached the midpoint of the bridge, the line ahead had already spread out across the far bank and into the town path, and the militia began calling that once the crossing was finished, the road would be locked and anyone stuck on the wrong bank would need curfew papers. The woman tried to lift her suitcase to walk faster, but the weight made her tilt sideways, and she had to set it down and shift her grip to prevent the case from slipping into the gap between two planks. The crossing finished without her. People on the far bank did not wait or form a second line. They merely kept walking toward the town while the woman struggled toward the far side alone. And when the militia shouted, "Clear the span!" the civilians obeyed and pushed forward, leaving her on the bridge with no escort and no help. The guards did not shut the bridge instantly, but they made it clear with their posture and tone that she no longer belonged to a group, but to a problem. And problems in wartime were handled with rules rather than kindness. The snow in the fields looked clean from far away, but the boards beneath her feet were soaked with melted frost that seeped into her shoes while the wind slid inside her sleeves. When she finally reached the final third of the bridge, the militia had stopped calling to the crowd and began calling to her alone, and the difference made her skin tighten beneath her scarf, because being called out individually during curfew procedures changed everything. The bridge was closing, and she was still on it, without company and without anyone willing to claim her pace as their responsibility. In war, that was a kind of abandonment too. When the woman reached the final edge of the bridge, 2 local militia guards placed their boots on the first plank beyond the beam, forming a narrow barrier that was not made of wood or rope, but of posture and authority, and they lifted their hands to stop her, as if slowing one person could speed up the whole procedure. They told her to wait because the bridge was closed for the night rotation, and that if she had arrived 10 minutes earlier, she would have crossed with the others without any discussion at all. The woman tried to explain that she had been in the line from the beginning, and that her suitcase had slowed her. But the guards did not argue or negotiate. They simply pointed to the fading daylight, the white breath in the air, and the nearby sign that announced curfew rules in the block letters. The problem was not her excuse. The problem was the clock. Civilians behind the closed sign sometimes tried to plead, but pleading did not change the hour, and the militia were not trained to comfort. They were trained to prevent violations. The guard at her left told her that the bridge would only open again in the morning after the curfew patrol returned from its rounds, and that for the night she would have to stay on the rural side unless she had the correct permit stamped by the district office. The woman had no such document because civilians usually received curfew permits only for work duties, medical transfers, or family emergencies, validated by paperwork. Her situation, being slow, was not a recognized category. The militia pointed toward a shed on the rural bank where other people without permits sometimes waited during cold nights, and though the shed had walls and a roof, it had no stove and no blankets, and people who stayed there often woke tired and hungry, or left before dawn to avoid patrol attention. The woman looked at the shed, looked at the snow climbing the ditches, and looked at the closed gate at the end of the bridge. There was no good choice, only cold or rules. When she asked if there was a way to cross before nightfall, if she walked faster or carried less weight, the militia shook their heads and said that the bridge group had closed the span, locked the chain, and written down the count for the day. Everything on the war side of the river was now considered inside, and everything on the farm side of the river, including the woman, her suitcase, and the splinters in her shoes, was considered outside. A man nearby whispered that, once someone was left outside, no civilian dared to call them back in because calling them back would count as assisting a violation, and violations were written down and reported. The wind had grown colder in the short time it took to refuse her passage, and the militia remained firm by the post, while the woman, cut off from the town, stood with her suitcase on a bridge now closed to her. Not because of suspicion or rumor, but because of time and rules that did not bend for tired civilians. Curfew in wartime made simple problems into long nights, and tonight she had become one of those problems. The small group of civilians who had crossed earlier had not gone far. Some lingered on the townside near the road because they wanted to watch the militia lower the barrier and chain the bridge before heading home for curfew. People in war tracked rules the way farmers once tracked weather, because one misread signal could change how the night went. When the woman was stopped on the last plank, these same civilians began whispering from the safety of the other bank, curious why she had been singled out and left behind. At first, they assumed she was late or unlucky, which would have been the simplest explanation, but soon the whispers changed to questions that did not even try to be kind. Someone asked if she had been sent back for inspection. Another suggested she might not be allowed inside. And because the war taught people to fill gaps with guesswork instead of facts, guesswork quickly became certainty. One older man muttered that she must be from the wrong district, and another woman said she remembered seeing her husband months earlier wearing a light-colored coat near the old road checkpoint, and because light-colored coats had once been issued by the occupying authority, the story gained a new shape that none of them bothered to verify. A boy, standing behind his mother, asked what happened to people who were left outside during curfew, and his mother told him quietly that some slept in barns, others in sheds, and others walked until morning if their legs were strong enough, and no patrol sent them back. The boy glanced toward the woman and then looked away, as if looking too long might make him responsible for her safety. On the rural side, the militia did not explain her situation to the crowd, because explanations created more discussion than compliance, and compliance was what the curfew demanded. With the sun sinking below the black trees, the woman's status changed from slow civilian to someone suspected of being held back on purpose, even though no one actually knew the reason. Wartime language was full of these half-phrases: held back, sent back, not cleared, wrong side, outside the gate. Phrases that did not accuse openly, but still separated people from everyone else. When one man on the town side said, "Better not wait for her," the rest nodded and turned toward their homes, because in winter, darkness and ration stoves did not wait for gossip to resolve. The woman remained on the bridge with her suitcase, listening to their footsteps fade into the town streets, and then to the clank of the chain as the militia locked the span for the night. She was not under arrest, and she was not accused of any crime, but being left outside the boundary during curfew hours made her a kind of problem that no civilian wanted to be connected to. Rumor had done what paperwork had not. It placed a border between her and the rest of the town long before the soldiers had touched a chain or lifted a padlock. A military truck painted in dull olive rolled up the road from the town depot and stopped near the bridge guard post just as the chain was being fastened, its engine firing short puffs of white smoke that mixed with the winter air. The driver, an American sergeant wearing a thick jacket with patches on the shoulders, shut off the engine, and stepped down from the cab to deliver papers to the militia. Routine road and curfew coordination for the night. He expected to sign forms, hand over a fuel slip, and return to the depot before the blackout hour. But when he turned to face the bridge, he noticed the woman standing alone on the last plank, suitcase in hand, and shoulders tight against the cold. Civilians usually crossed in groups, especially before curfew, and it was strange to see one person stranded without anyone hurrying them along. The sergeant had seen enough towns and enough zones to know that there were only 3 reasons for a lone civilian at a road barrier: paperwork trouble, rumor trouble, or time trouble. His eyes studied the posture of the militia, and he saw no aggression, no accusations, and no inspection forms on the table. Only impatience, and the kind of shrug that meant, the clock closed on her, not us. That told him the category: time trouble. Time was the strictest wartime officer. It could punish without raising its voice. The sergeant walked closer to the chain so he could hear the exchange between the militia and the civilian, and he heard nothing angry, nothing loud, just the rigid sentences of curfew procedure. Bridge closed. No permit. Morning crossing only. Shed if needed. He looked across the fields, saw no houses nearby, and understood immediately that the shed was not a shelter in the true sense, but a roof to keep snow off heads until morning, with cold doing the rest. The woman did not argue or cry. She simply stood with the suitcase in front of her, boots pressed into the boards as if leaving would somehow abandon her claim to the town she had tried to reach. The sergeant had transported civilians before, refugees, evacuees, or displaced families, and he recognized the silent signs of someone who had been traveling for days: the grip on the suitcase handle, the slow tilt of the shoulders, and the fixed gaze on the lights of the town as if warmth was visible through walls. The militia, busy with their forms, barely looked at her a second time. Once the chain was up, the civilian became part of the other side of the map, and maps did not show cold or loneliness. The sergeant exhaled and checked the sky. The darkness was almost complete, and the blackout lamps would be lit soon. Civilians, caught in the wrong sector during blackout, risked patrol questioning or redirect. He tapped the bridge rail once with his glove, not to signal the militia, but because he now understood that leaving her outside was not a matter of rumor or accusation. It was simply war as procedure, and procedure did not care about frozen feet or empty stomachs. But he did. The American sergeant walked back toward his truck, not to leave the scene, but to pull a small leather folder from the dashboard that carried his night papers: route permit, fuel allocation sheet, officer of the bridge pass, and a stamped voucher that authorized cross-sector movement for supply vehicles. He returned to the chain with the folder in his glove and asked the militia guard a simple question: "She needs a permit to cross?" The guard nodded quickly, relieved to answer a question that did not challenge rules. "Curfew closes at sundown. No permit, no entry," he replied. The sergeant did not argue about the rule. He asked instead if a vehicle permit counted as escort authorization, and the guard hesitated because escort authorization was not often used for lone civilians at small bridges. But the rule did exist in the handbook for medical transfers and war widows traveling between sectors. The militia guard finally said, "If you sign escort, she goes under you," meaning that if the sergeant took responsibility, the bridge could open for both. And if anyone asked later why the woman had crossed, the paperwork would point to the man with the stripes on his jacket, not the conscript with cold hands. The sergeant nodded once and signed the escort line on his voucher, his handwriting wide and steady, then slid the voucher beneath the chain so the guard could copy the number onto his ledger. That was all it took for the machinery of rules to change shape. The same guard who had refused the woman minutes earlier now lifted the chain without complaint. Because rules were not the enemy. Rules only needed a signature from someone the rulebook recognized. The woman did not move at first because she did not understand that the gesture was for her. Civilians who had been denied learned to stand still until told otherwise. The sergeant walked onto the bridge and stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough to block the wind with his back. He did not say anything about her being late or slow or unlucky. He simply tapped her suitcase once with his glove and motioned with a tilt of his head toward the truck as if to say, "Come with me." She picked up the case and followed without speaking. When she reached the end of the bridge, the civilians who had watched her earlier now stared again, but this time their looks held confusion instead of judgment, because the woman they had called Problem now walked under the rules of someone who could cross boundaries. The sergeant opened the truck's rear canvas flap, helped her climb into the back where blankets and ration crates were stored, and secured the flap without the slightest show of favor or pity. It was not kindness in a big dramatic form. It was an administrative correction disguised as help, and in war, that was often the strongest kind. When the militia finished recording the crossing, they waved the sergeant through, and the truck rolled off the bridge toward the town lights as the chain fell behind them and the road returned to silence. The truck moved slowly along the frozen road because wartime roads hated speed. They were full of potholes from old shell craters and covered in thin ice that snapped under the tires like brittle glass. Inside the rear of the truck, the woman sat among folded blankets and wooden crates stamped with dull black letters. Biscuits, soap, medical, and tea. Supplies meant for the relief depot closer to the town center. She held her suitcase between her knees to keep it from sliding as the truck bounced. And every so often she adjusted her scarf so it covered the lower part of her face, not for style or modesty, but because wind found any gap in clothing it could. The sergeant drove without talking, eyes scanning the fields and fence posts for signs of patrols or lanterns, because blackout hours made movement difficult, even for authorized vehicles. He turned the truck toward the old school building that had been converted into a civilian shelter after the first winter of occupation. And as the engine hummed, the woman saw the difference between being outside looking in and being inside looking out. From beyond the bridge, the town had looked like a collection of warm windows and yellow lamps. But inside the shelter zone, those lights belonged to real rooms, with real walls that blocked wind and rumor. When the truck stopped at the side entrance of the converted school, the sergeant shut off the engine and hopped down first to open the rear flap. He held out a hand, not for a dramatic lift, but for balance, because stepping down from truck beds was a common way to twist ankles during war. The woman took the offer and landed on the packed snow with only a soft crunch. The shelter assistant at the door looked surprised to see a civilian arrive under escort so late, but the sergeant simply tapped the escort voucher and pointed toward the intake table inside. The assistant recognized the stamp, nodded, and waved the woman through as if escort arrivals were as normal as deliveries of soap. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of chalk and kerosene from the old stove units that had been placed in classrooms to fight the winter cold. The blackboards still carried half-erased arithmetic from years before the war, and the desks had been pushed aside to make space for cots and blankets. The woman was told to register her name for the night, so the curfew log would not mark her as unaccounted, and she gave her name in a voice that sounded tired but steady. The assistant wrote it down in pencil, beside the words "late arrival, escort," and directed her to a cot with one folded blanket. The sergeant stood in the doorway long enough to watch her reach the cot and set her suitcase beside it, because in war it was not enough to bring someone into a building. You had to make sure the building accepted them. Only after the assistant placed her name in the ledger did the sergeant turn to leave. He had not promised comfort, and he had not offered pity, but he had moved her from outside the boundary to inside the shelter. In wartime, that was the difference between a night in the shed and a night under blankets. In the converted classroom, the shelter workers moved through rows of cots, calling names from the curfew roster, so they could match bodies to ledgers before the blackout lamps were dimmed for the night. Most names were answered quickly because families clustered close. But when the worker called the woman's name, there was no cluster, no family, just one voice that answered from the corner cot with the suitcase at its foot. The worker walked over with a clipboard and checked her entry. He paused at late arrival, escort, and looked toward the doorway to see which uniform had brought her in. The sergeant was still standing there, waiting for the ledger to confirm what the bridge had denied, her right to be counted as inside. Once the worker stamped the ledger, he also stamped a small paper chit that served as proof of shelter status for the night, then handed it to the woman with a nod that did not look like charity or suspicion. Just simple acknowledgement that she belonged on the ledger and under the roof. A few women in nearby cots glanced over, not with rumor this time, but with curiosity about someone who had almost missed the cutoff. In wartime, survival often depended on minutes and signatures, so anyone who arrived late and still made it inside gained a kind of respect that was quiet but real. The woman placed the shelter chit beneath her pillow, not because she feared losing it, but because it symbolized something the bridge crowd had taken from her earlier: permission without shame. The sergeant handed his escort voucher to the intake worker, who signed it and returned a copy for his unit records, then offered a short sentence. "She's staying for the night." That was the full declaration. There was no need for flowery explanations or justifications. In the shelter, facts were enough. The worker pointed to a tin cup and a pot of warm broth near the stove and told the woman to take some before lights dimmed. She stood and ladled a portion into the cup, warming her hands around the metal as she walked back to her cot. One of the other women in the room gestured for her to sit at a nearby bench while she drank, and the woman accepted, taking small sips while steam wrapped around her face. No one asked why she had been late or whether she had a permit or what district she came from. Those questions belonged to daylight and bureaucracy, not to shelters where blankets were counted more closely than opinions. The sergeant finally stepped back from the doorway and prepared to leave, but before turning down the hall, he watched as the shelter worker wrote the woman's name into the final curfew summary sheet, with the number 1 next to it. That number meant she was accounted for, protected from night patrol questioning, and officially inside the civilian safety roster. Rumor had no space on those sheets. Only names and tallies appeared there. After the sheet was signed, the sergeant nodded once, satisfied that the process had been completed properly, and walked down the hall toward the blackout curtains in the cold street beyond. For the first time since the bridge, the woman's shoulders lowered, not from exhaustion, but from something quieter. Dignity returned through paper, shelter, and being counted in. When the blackout lamps were lowered and the classroom shelter grew dim and yellow, the stove near the old blackboard clicked as its metal cooled, and the room settled into the sound that wartime shelters knew best: quiet breathing, slow shifting on cots, and the occasional cough from someone who had spent too much time outdoors. The woman finished the last of her broth and folded her coat beneath her as a pillow, so the thin shelter blanket could reach her shoulders more easily. For a few minutes, she listened to the snow tapping against the windowpane, a soft and steady rhythm that made the school feel less like a shelter and more like a building that was simply doing its best to be useful during a hard year. Her suitcase sat upright beside the cot, not opened, not unpacked, as if keeping its shape allowed her to remember that she had arrived by choice and not by capture. Down the hall, the shelter assistant closed the ledger for the night and clipped the curfew report to a larger binder. Once names entered that binder, patrols knew not to question those sleepers, and soldiers on the street no longer had to ask who belonged where. In war, certainty, even the quiet kind, was a form of mercy. Outside the shelter, the American sergeant walked back to his truck and started the engine with a short burst of noise that echoed off the brick walls before softening into a low hum. He checked his route papers under the dash lamp and then drove toward the depot to report that the bridge crossing had been completed and that no civilians remained on the wrong side. He did not tell anyone the woman's story, and he did not frame his action as kindness. In the language of his paperwork, it would appear as one escorted civilian delivered to authorized shelter, and that was enough. Inside the classroom, the woman watched the light from the hallway fade as the curtains were drawn, and for the first time since stepping onto the wooden bridge, she was not being hurried, judged, or turned away. She pulled the blanket closer to her chin and let her breath warm the small space beneath it. The war outside did not stop for her, and it did not change because she had been escorted across a bridge. Artillery still thumped at distant fronts. Trains still carried soldiers to new sectors, and rumors still traveled faster than facts in a dozen nearby towns. But here, on this cot in a building built for students, she was not a problem to be solved, or a civilian left outside the chain. She was simply counted, sheltered, and allowed to sleep. In wartime, that was not small. That was safety in the plainest form it could take. By morning, the curfew would lift, the stove would be stoked again, and names would be read for departure or stay. The woman did not know whether she would travel onward or remain in the town, and she did not try to decide before sleep. For now, she closed her eyes, listened to the snow, and let the war continue elsewhere, while she rested beneath a borrowed blanket, on the right side of the river at last.